Are you in a spot where you would say that anybody can decrease their injury risk down to 0 and be a runner? Or do you think it's not quite that simple?
It's such on the forefront of people's mind. People like want to do as much as they can to reduce their risk of injury. People are really worried about getting injured because either they've had an injury before and they know how disruptive it can be to their training or their race preparations. And like we said, it's so prevalent in the population. And so those who are under the expectations that they can try and do things to get their risk down to 0, I think is unrealistic. Running is a sport where you just want to do more. You want to continue pushing the envelope. You have a half marathon, then you go to a full marathon, then you want to do 3 marathons in a year, then you want to do a faster marathon, then you want to do an ultra marathon. And then as you continue to strive and push the boundaries, push the envelope, your body's going to start getting sore, and there's only going to be certain limitations. And what I like to reassure runners about is that while you can't get that risk down to 0, it's an unrealistic expectation. There are exceptions to the rule where people have ran for 10 years and never got injured. I think that's so rare, but you can do things. You can train smarter to reduce that risk of injury that you currently have. How much we reduce that by, it's really hard to say, but where I like to position myself is true injury prevention is if these things come up and you do start getting a little niggle or soreness or stiffness, or you wake up the next day and your tendon's a little bit stiff, it's recognizing it and accurately interpreting those particular symptoms, and then know exactly what to do, day 1, day 2, week 1, to swiftly negotiate that injury without losing fitness. You can still keep active. You're not going to disrupt your training. It's not going to bring it to a halt. You just continue doing the right things, remaining very proactive, and return back to pain-free running without losing fitness. That's my definition of true injury prevention. And so it does require a fair bit of education, and that's where I like to position myself.
That's a paradigm shift for people to think about, because like you said, you're saying injury prevention doesn't just happen before something pops up. It's preventing that thing that's popping up to really take you out. And that I think that's a huge shift. And that's a lot easier to attain than it is to never let any sort of discomfort or pain or tightness or stiffness or whatever to pop up in the first place.
And I think that's really important, because I think once runners can kind of understand that, it'll probably take that fear away from a lot of these injuries. Because what people are afraid of, right, is, oh, it's going to take me out. Oftentimes when people have their first major injury or the repeated episodes, like I wasn't able to run for X number of weeks, that kind of stuff, where I think kind of rephrasing that and going, just so you know, that's not a realistic expectation, that even the research on injury risk, this stuff is incredibly hard to do. And if, Laurent Maslow, who we got to have on, was really key about that, going, you can certainly reduce your risk, but just like you were saying, all the evidence has said, you can't eliminate it. Stuff happens. Stuff happens you might not even expect it. It might not even be related to running. It might be rolling your ankle because you're just walking somewhere and you weren't paying attention. So that stuff happens. But to rephrase that, instead of being so fearful, go, why don't we help you with the tools, which we're going to talk about today, of how to identify this stuff, and then go, what do I do about this so I can continue running rather than having the same interruption that I've had in the past?
I think runners are really hard on themselves. As soon as they maybe make a training error, they wake up and their knee's sore and they look back on their last week of training okay, I've obviously overdone it. They're really down on themselves when they are injured. And not only that, because there's the fear of losing fitness, there's a fear of wanting to, prepare for a race that's coming up. They're more likely, if they're in that mindset, to mismanage it initially and run through that injury, run too far, too fast, and just ignore it and say, hopefully it gets better. And then they just continue to mismanage it and overload it and make it worse. And it's only because those expectations and those fears and, the misguidance that just continues to manifest and make it worse. And it's the number one fear when someone's injured. It's oh my God, I'm going to lose all my progress. I've worked 12 weeks in a row to build up this fitness to prepare for this marathon, and now it's all going to be derailed because of this injury. And they put it in the back of their mind, let's just push through, and hopefully it just resolves itself because I'm not going to lose fitness. I want to keep working my way towards this race. And, it brings them undone. It makes things worse. And then it leads to a greater disruption. It requires a greater disruption to overcome that injury later down the track.
Right. I think that right there is a huge point too, where for most of us, some people are in this season where they are elite runners and they they have a certain window of their life to run at a level that really matters. Whether you're like, oh, I really want to win state in high school, or I want to be a certain level at the college level, or I want to be an Olympian. Those have some timestamps on them. But for the large majority of runners, it's not this is a lifelong sport, and sometimes our short-term goal, even if it's a marathon, that's still a short-term goal, shadows how we can, put ourselves in a position to succeed long-term. And we get this tunneling effect of like these, I can't, like you said, like short-term fitness loss means complete derailment of my entire running career, when that's not really true. And I think that's a huge reshift. I do want to ask you one more kind of foundational question, but before we talk about early signs of injury. And what are some of the things that you think about when you think about what puts runners at the highest risk of injury? What are some of those either mistakes or just those risk factors that you think are the most common?